Welcome everyone to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 34th meeting of 2020. Our first item today is to decide whether to take item 6 in private, and that is consideration of the evidence heard on the Environmental Standards Scotland. Are members agreed? They are. Thank you very much, colleagues. The agenda item 2 is withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Bill, appointments to the interim board of the non-statutory environmental governance body Environmental Standards Scotland, or ESS as we will refer to it throughout this morning. And then we've got an evidence session with the nominees for the interim board of this governance body. And just to introduce them, we've got Jim Martin, the proposed chair, Paul McAlevey, Richard Dixon, Marie Fallon and Annalisa Savarese. Thank you all for making time this morning. We've got you up very early, but we wanted to meet you as soon as possible. So thank you for making yourselves available this time in the morning before the sun's even up. And also for providing us with a biography and a summary of your statement of suitability, which you've provided and is available on our website so that people watching can also see that as well. It's been very helpful. We've got an hour this morning and an awful lot to cover, but before I start asking questions, I just want to make it clear that to those watching that we are not making a decision on your appointment today. You've already been appointed. This is part of our scrutiny function as the committee to meet you and to go through your suitability for appointment and some of your intentions with regards to ESS. So we will not be going into areas around the scope of ESS that are still to be decided, because we are somewhat unusually in the position of not having the bill included parliamentary scrutiny. So we still have stage 3 to go, and we have outstanding questions around the scope of ESS that the Cabinet Secretary is going to be addressing. So we'll try and keep away from that and concentrate on you as the board members. So with that in mind, the expertise in the panel, it's reading your biographies and knowing some of you is obvious to people that know you, the wealth of experience that you have to bring to these roles. I'd like to come to Jim, first of all, just to allow you to go over why you've been appointed and why you're the chair and what you bring to the role.
Thank you, Convener. I was asked more than a year ago now if I would chair an interim panel, as it was to be called at that time, because at that point, if you recall, we thought that we were going to have an immediate exit from the European Union. So I spent some time working with officials and helping to recruit other members of the panel, which never actually met. I'm pleased to say we didn't have a cliff edge Brexit at that time. And so began to lay the foundations for what is now ESS in its form. So I've considerable experience of trying to pull that together, but in my past lives I have previous experience of setting up a public body, and I have been the Public Services Ombudsman for Scotland for around 8 years, and so I'm used to investigating difficult, complex and very publicly controversial issues and coming to solutions which are not always popular, I have to say, but in the role of the chair of ESS will become, I think, very, very useful, that experience. I've got a clear vision for where I think ESS needs to go, and I think that looking at the colleagues that I have on the board, I think we've got complementary skills across a range of areas that we will need to bring some expertise to the panel. And it's a panel, I think, Convener, which, though we haven't had much time to speak to each other yet, I think is a panel that can ask the right questions. And I'm pretty sure it's a panel that will dig for the right answers as well.
And you do have experience of setting up an organisation from scratch, which is effectively what's happening here and very quickly.
Yes, I was Scotland's first Police Complaints Commissioner. And I was asked to begin that organisation literally from scratch, I mean, without any resources, with no premises, no people, no systems, no policies, no procedures, and given a very short timescale to set up an organisation, get it running, and to be credible. And at the time, it was a pretty controversial organisation to be set up because there was some resistance to the establishment of a police complaints commission in Scotland. But I'm pleased to say that very quickly that became an accepted part of Scottish life and has developed and has morphed now into PIRC and has become a standing part of corporate governance in Scotland.
I should clarify, I misspoke earlier around the appointment. Your appointments will, of course, will depend on approval by Parliament, a motion in Parliament, so I should have made that clear. Thanks very much, Jim. I'll come back to you, but I'd like to go on to Paul McAlevey, just the same question to you.
Good morning, convener. Yeah, I'm by profession, I'm a European Union civil servant. I've worked for the European Commission for the last 25 years, many of which in the area of environment and climate. The last few years I've been seconded here to the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen, where my job has been to strengthen the role of that agency as a watchdog for Europe's environment and climate policy. I'm highly motivated to work on these questions. I think we face the twin crises of biodiversity and climate, and I think the European Union just now is moving forward with really ambitious plans in the form of the 8th Environment Action Programme, the European Green Deal, and they're really setting quite a high level of ambition. And I think what I can bring to the panel is those years of experience in order to help Scotland keep pace. I think it's absolutely essential that Scotland does keep pace and doesn't miss the opportunity. A bit more in terms of my competence. I'm used to working with lots of data. I'm used to working with experts. I'm used to analysing uncertainties, environmental and climate science in order to inform policymakers. So what I would bring is the experience of working in the EU for 25 years and the experience of actually working for an independent watchdog at the EU level.
And also some time at the EEA as well, I believe.
Yeah, I'm just finishing my tasks here at the European Environment Agency. I was seconded from the Commission to the agency, partly to strengthen the agency, to give the agency a more teeth as a watchdog for EU policy. I think I've done that. I'm just about to move back to Brussels to take on a job there, working for the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. That's the scientific service of the European Commission, where I'll be working in the senior management there to help shape the scientific evidence that is brought to European Union decision making, not just in the environment and climate area, but across a broad range of areas: economic modelling, nuclear energy, etc. So I'm used to working at the interface between science and politics.
Okay, thank you very much. And Richard Dixon, over to you. Same question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a PhD in astrophysics, which gives me a very good grounding in science and makes me nearly a rocket scientist. I have an MSc in Energy Systems and Environmental Management. I also have 25 years working at Friends of the Earth, WWF, and then Friends of the Earth again. And that work is about working in that space of science, policy, politics, and media. And that requires me to work on climate change, on air pollution, on circular economy, and to understand those issues, and of course to be very passionate about those issues. Managerially, Friends of the Earth next year will have about the same budgets and the same number of staff as ESS is expected to have. So I have managerial experience which is relevant. And of course, I've been on the board of SEPA for 8 years until the end of last year. Indeed, it was Stuart Stevenson who originally appointed me. Thank you very much. And I was on the audit committee of SEPA for most of that time. So again, I've seen how a big public body works. And I've been involved in those discussions about regulation and environmental standards at the SEPA board. And I hope that for ESS, I will be a very strong interface with SEPA, so that we make that crucial relationship relationship work really well.
Thank you. I was going to ask about that, but you covered it, and that interface is really important. It's something that we've been discussing as we've been scrutinising the setting up of ESS. Can I come to Mary Fallon?
Good morning, convener. I've got a very wide background in environmental matters. I've over 35 years experience working in the public sector. Primarily, my early career was in local government, various roles with the environment as a very core part of my roles. And then the last 7 years, I've worked for the Environment Agency in England, where I held a regional role and then a national role. And so what I want to bring to the ESS is experience of being on the public sector side of it, but also the experience of actually trying to deliver environmental issues at a local and a national level. I've got a lot of experience of working with different partners, with complex issues, with trying to interpret how environmental law needs to be delivered at a local level as well as a national level, and trying to really get under the skin of, well, is a particular law or regulation actually going to deliver the outcomes in terms of the environment? And sometimes, things are put forward and the actual ability to deliver the outcomes aren't actually there. And so what I'm really keen is that really trying to make sure that in terms of improvement and improvement of the environment and the legislation can be achieved through the ESS. I've worked on many complex issues, from nuclear to waste to many different regulatory side of it. I've worked with lots of different partners, both at national government, different sectors, with different industries and major international companies. So I think I can bring experience of working with industry to the ESS board, as well as my ability to work across different individuals and work as a collective. I've worked on different boards in the past, as well as chaired different boards. So I'm very experienced in terms of how a board needs to operate in order to take things forward.
And your experience working in the environmental landscape in England is going to be crucial as an interface as well, your knowledge of that.
That's right. I mean, I've worked with SEPA and other agencies in Scotland, but obviously my experience of working in England will be helpful to work with the Office of Environmental Protection, and making sure that that interface can be well connected so that we're able to work effectively together.
Okay, thank you. And finally, in our round robin, summary of your experience to Dr. Annalisa Savarese.
Good morning, convener. I'm an academic and an expert in environmental law. I have 2 years experience working with governmental and non-governmental organizations, such as the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I'm presently senior lecturer at the University of Stirling, having previously held positions at the Universities of Edinburgh and Copenhagen. So I bring to the board expertise in law, clearly, including international and EU law. I have a track record of engaging both the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, matters related to environmental governance and EU exit, as members of the committee probably already know.
Yes, you have been a frequent panellist in our committee over the last few years. Right, I'm going to open it up to my colleagues in the committee and come to Claudia Beamish now. Claudia.
Thank you very much, convener, and good morning to all those who are here this morning. Thank you very much for your initial comments in response to our convener's question. So could I ask you all in turn, and I'm going to come to Jim last, having heard what the other are saying as the chair, about any possible weaknesses as a board, if you see them, as if there are any in your view. And also, are there any specific areas of expertise that you see that might be lacking? And I appreciate that it's an early hour in the morning and it's early days for yourselves. But it would be about, if you see overall, I'm not looking individually, but as a board, if you see any areas of perhaps gaps or weaknesses or a need for other expertise. So could I start, please, with Marie?
I think, as you say, it's very early days in terms of the board being established, and also trying to understand what the actual legislation will require the board to do. So I think what we're trying to do at the moment is just take a step back and make sure that we've got all the elements in place, because it'll be a combination both of the board members, but also the actual staff in the secretariat supporting the panel. But as a board, I mean, we will still be able to come seek expertise and input into any of our discussions at an early stage. So I can't say, well, it's going to be this or that, because I think it's far too early for me to be able to come to that conclusion. But I'm confident that between us that, we've got the opportunity to sort of really identify some of those gaps.
Thank you very much. And could I come to Richard, please?
Thanks very much. So I think we do have a good range of experience and networks around the table, and networks is really important. Obviously, Jim has the experience of setting up a public range of experience and networks around the table, and networks is really important. Obviously, Jim has the experience of setting up a public body. That's absolutely crucial. Who we get as staff members is going to be really important, of course, and their skill set. One gap that has been suggested, and it's mentioned in the legislation as it's currently drafted, is environmental science, and I wanted to address that. We do have, according to the current version of the bill, the capacity to appoint 2 more board members, so we can fill gaps if we have them. But just on environmental science, you've heard from us when we introduced ourselves, our familiarity, many of us, with environmental science and issues around that. And I think between Paul, Mary and myself, I counted we have 8 decades worth of dealing with issues to do with environmental science. So we understand how you measure fecal coliforms in relation to bathing water. We understand the health impacts of air pollution. We know how to look at an emissions inventory for industrial sector. So we have a great deal of familiarity with environmental science, even if that may not be academically in our background. And importantly, we know lots of people who we would ask if we needed to know more. So I don't think that's particularly a gap, but it's one we would fill with the contacts and networks we had. And if we needed to, that might be another skill set we would look for in further board members when we get to that stage.
Thank you, Richard. And could I come to Annelies, please?
Much for that question. As a lawyer, I'm of course bound to say that expertise in Scots law may be regarded as a weakness in the present membership of the panel. But again, this is expertise that we are well positioned to source as a group, and indeed in the context of the recruitment of board members.
Thank you. And could I come to Paul, please?
Yeah, thanks for the question. As we said, that we haven't actually met yet formally as a board, so it's a bit difficult to talk to the question. I do feel though that we have quite a good balance. I think I'd like to make a couple of points. One is maybe a self-aware point. I haven't worked in Scotland myself since the more than quarter of a century. I haven't lost my accent, you'll be happy to hear, even though I've picked up Swedish citizenship along the way. I've tried to keep up my knowledge as an EU civil servant of what goes on in Scotland, and certainly for me that's something that I'm looking to deepen and learn from the colleagues on the board. I'd also like to say something about what Richard said about science. It's just to add a little point. I'm not myself an environmental scientist, but I've been managing environmental scientists, taking responsibility for their work, modelers, etc. So even if there are gaps in our knowledge, we know exactly where we need to go in our networks to fill them in.
Thank you very much, Paul. And just before I come to you, Jim, I just wanted to highlight for the public record, because of course all the panelists today know this, but the person specification for the member role is awareness of environmental policy and/or law, evaluating complex sources of evidence to reach sound judgments, communicating with and influencing others, understanding of parliamentary, legal and governance systems, and ability to work cooperatively and collaboratively with others. And particularly the person specification for the chair, experience of building and supporting a new organisation, and a track record of leading and developing strategic investigations with objectivity. And of course the other ones are also highly relevant. So could I turn to you to make any initial comment on any gaps or any ways in which you might address those? Thank you.
At a very early stage, the board is going to have to sit down and work out what kind of organisation ESS is going to be. And that means beginning to think through what the strategy for the organisation should be, to engage with the stakeholders in the sector to understand their thinking. Then as a board, we have to sit down and look at ourselves and work out whether we do have all the skills that we need. I think we've got a good breadth, we've got a good starting breadth. But as we look at our strategic direction, if we feel that we have gaps at board level rather than executive team level, then there is still scope for us to enhance the board in terms of numbers. I think we've got room for another 2, and to determine if we do want to do that, what skills we need. And I think once we've actually got into thinking through the practicalities of how the board is going to go about its business and take its decisions, how the board and the senior executive team together provide the skills and expertise that the organisation needs to have, only at that time will we really be able to see whether or not there's a real skills gap. And if there is, I wouldn't hesitate to go to ministers to say that we need to fill a gap and that we need to have an extra board member or 2 board members if that be the case. But I think it's an informed decision that needs to be taken. At the moment, I think we've got an excellent breadth of experience to draw on to set up the organisation and to begin to engage with our important stakeholders to understand what the organisation needs to do in the future.
Thank you very much. And lastly, could you just kindly clarify for the public record just how the appointments are made to the executive team, please?
The executive team are a matter for the board to appoint team. Ministers appoint the board appoint the team.
Thank you, that's very helpful, and thank you all for your answers.
Thank you. And now Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I've just got a fairly narrow focused question. And just to be clear, I'm not asking, because Liz Smith will come on to this, how nominees have worked together in the past and might in the future. So my question is kind of almost a stress question. For each person who wants to answer this question, and I'm going to come to Richard Dixon first, but what weaknesses you have that you think other board members, your knowledge of them, can particularly fill and complement areas where you are less strong. I'm testing simply how well you come to the table knowing each other, recognising that you've yet to meet and have in-depth chat about that. Richard Dixon.
Thank you. That's a good question. Well put. I would say, as you say, we haven't really met. We've kind of just heard each other talk about our CVs. We've seen a bit of documentation about each other. I've already said that, of course, Jim has great experience in the area of setting up a public body. That's really important. As you will obviously understand, Paul brings a great deal of understanding of the workings of the European Union. And if one of the things we're to look at is how do we, as we evolve standards in Scotland, how do we keep up with Europe, then that experience, those networks are actually crucial for that. Mary obviously brings the real depth of day-to-day experience of environmental regulation, so that's really helpful. Annalisa, of course, absolutely expert in law. She's, I think, being a bit self-deprecating, talking about a gap in Scots law because her knowledge is extremely broad, and she's one of the panel members who I have actually met before and interacted with. So I'm very well aware of her skills in that area. So I think we have a broad range of skills that are pretty complementary, and I think those are the main areas where I would say these people know quite a lot more than me on those things.
Thank you for that. I'm not going to go right round the table because I'm watching the clock a little bit. So I'm just going to go to Marie in particular because coming from south of the border, I'm interested in what her view beyond what she's already said, and then perhaps Annalisa.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess I understand the Scottish context in broad terms, down the organisations on paper, and I've obviously worked with some of the Scottish agencies. I guess the bit that I'm missing is the sort of dynamics underneath it. So you can look at an organisation, but then understanding what role they play, what their concerns are, what their expectations are of the ESS. So I would be expecting working with the other board members who I've not met and not worked with before to really help me to understand the sort of dynamics of how things actually work in practice, and who we need to work with more effectively and who people are already working with effectively. So it's really that relationship that I'm looking forward to start getting to grips with. But I'm confident from the very short time that we've had to meet together that we'll get on great, and we'll be able to understand some of those things, and I'll be able to bring some of the experience that I've got from working in England to the party as well.
Right, now I'm not going to Jim and Paul because I think in previous answers they kind of touched on this, but finally Annalisa.
So one of the main tasks of this new body is, of course, to bridge the enforcement gaps associated with EU exit, and this is a rather unique body in many respects for that reason. I do think that having Jim leading us is definitely important because he has experience in setting up new bodies that need to keep the floor running. So we need to get down to the job immediately and be ready to learn by doing. I like to think that I'm good at doing that. Many roles I've covered in the past were really associated with I need to learn by doing, but I feel confident that under Jim's leadership we can really set up a robust new body that will be up to the challenge that's facing us.
Thank you. And now on to questions from Liz Smith.
My question is very much for Jim Martin. In an answer to the convener, Mr. Martin, you said that you had quite a strong vision for where you thought ESS would be going. And I'm particularly interested in that because I think as we have approached the bill, the area where we have been most lobbied and by the members of the public and the general interest in the Part 2, the environment part of the bill, has been very much around the powers of the ESS. And I know you can't talk about that specifically just now, but I'm interested in what you do see as the vision for this, because I think there's a very high expectation from the public. So could you just comment on where you think this vision might be?
The opportunity to do that. I think ESS needs to maintain Scotland's place as a leading nation, recognised at home and internationally, as striving towards environmental excellence. That's basically where we are. And I think we build that on the EU environmental principles. It has to be an organisation, and I stress this very strongly, that is independent of government, independent of any other agency. It's an impartial body. It's a robust body, because I think we will need to have not only strength of character, but we need to have very sharp elbows as well. And we need to be fair. We need to be seen to be fair, and that means we need to be transparent. We need to be engaging. We can't be a body that sits aloof and apart from everyone else. We have to engage with stakeholders, with the public. We have to listen. Above all, we need to be a credible organisation. And credibility can only be built through putting in good, strong processes and procedures which are seen to be fair and which everyone can understand is for the benefit of Scotland. And I think the board needs to set the tone for that, and that's internally and externally. I think we need to set a culture within the organisation, a set of values within the organisation, which will help the organisation to aspire to the kind of vision I'm suggesting. But also externally, we need to live up to those values. So what I want to create is an exemplar organisation which can, with credibility, almost become Scotland's environmental conscience. And I think we can do that.
Thank you very much. And without going into any of the detail, because we haven't got time about what the structures might be, do you have quite a strong view, as it stands just now, about what structures you think need to be put in place to deliver what you've just set out just now?
I do. There are a number of key things that this board are going to have to do very quickly. We're going to have to start thinking about our strategy very, very quickly. And we're going to have to engage with people around that to help us think. We've got to listen, we've got to learn, and then we've got to decide on that. We've got to work out what expertise we need in our senior team to help support the board and to enable us to go forward. We need to work out what we're going to monitor, how we're going to monitor it, and put processes and procedures in place to do that. We need to have a strong, robust investigation function with good policies and processes and procedures and good expertise to lead that. In other words, we have got everything to do to set up that credible organisation very, very quickly. And if you look at the composition of the board, between us, we have the necessary skills, but not all of us have all of the skills. So that when we come to select the team which are going to deliver for ESS, we have to do that in the context of the breadth and gaps that the board currently has.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now can I come to Angus MacDonald?
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning and congratulations to you all on your nominations. Now, there may be a perception out there among some members of the public that board members have a conflict of interest with regard to their existing roles. So if any of you feel that that's the case, how might that conflict be mitigated to ensure an objective approach to your work on the ESS? And maybe if we could start with Richard.
Thank you very much. I think you make an important point, which is that there may be a perception that there's a conflict of interest, and real conflict of interest is a serious thing we need to deal with, but actually the perception of conflict of interest is also really important. And obviously for me, working for an environmental campaigning organisation, there may be more potential for conflict than with the other members of the panel today. And so obviously we've thought about this quite a bit. In terms of confidentiality and conflict of interest, obviously both organisations involved have policies. As a public body, ESS will have rules to obey on conflict of interest, and we will no doubt develop our own conflict of interest policy more specifically. So at both ends of that chain, the organisations are already putting in place safeguards about conflict of interest. And I'm very confident that we can manage any potential conflicts of interest very successfully. I spent 8 years on the board of SEPA, and at that time, Friends of the Earth was in the middle of trying to prevent fracking taking off in Scotland. That's something Angus MacDonald knows all about. And so there would be discussions at the SEPA board where I would not take part, or I would declare an interest, and we would decide whether or not I would take part in that discussion. So we were very alive to that. So the chair and I were very alive to the potential for conflicts of interest. There were times when I would be at a SEPA meeting where I would know something useful, but I couldn't say it because it came from my other job. And the same the other way around. At Friends of the Earth, I would be in a chat and I would know something from my role on the SEPA board, but I couldn't say it. So I'm very clear about compartmentalising my knowledge in terms of strict confidentiality of information, and also in terms of being very, very clear when there might be either a real or a perceived conflict of interest that we would need to address. And obviously, if we're in a board meeting, I would say I may have a conflict of interest here and explain that. If it's outside of a board meeting, I would be speaking to the chair about whether there was a conflict of interest here or not. So yes, there is the potential, but there will be systems in place, and I will be very rigorous in being ultra careful to make sure that we address conflicts of interest if they arise, or potential conflicts of interest, and that we respect confidentiality where we are sharing information.
Okay, thank you. Do any of the other members of the board feel that there could be a perception of a conflict of interest with their current roles? No? Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, if Jim maybe wants to give an overview, but other than that, no one seems to be indicating. Jim?
It's to give the committee an assurance, convener, that as with all public bodies, we will have a very robust code of conduct which will be applied quite rigorously. And it will be very important, for example, in this organisation, because of our investigative function, that we are seen to be making sure that there are no conflicts of interest. So in our investigative policies and procedures, there will be particular rules of engagement for the board with the investigation to ensure that conflicts of interest are known and that they are dealt with. So I just wanted to give the committee that assurance.
That's very helpful, thank you. And Paul McAlevey wants to come in.
Yes, thank you, convener. I asked for the chair not because I have any conflict of interest in this process, but as an EU employee, I'm required to be absolutely independent also as an employee of the European Union. It's required, according to the staff regulations, for me as a European Commission civil servant. I have to work autonomously, impartially, in an objective manner. And just for the record, when I move back to Brussels in January, I will need to have an approval from the European Commission to take up a position as a non-executive director on the board of ESS, precisely for that reason, that I can't have any conflict of interest in that direction either. So I just wanted to make that absolutely clear and for the record.
Thank you for doing that. And now over to Mary Fallon.
Yeah, mine's only a minor one in the fact that I'm a board member on the Northumberland National Park, which obviously has a boundary with Scotland, and we obviously share the interests of the River Tweed. But I'm, like other members on the board, is that I'm very confident that if there is a conflict of interest, I will be able to declare that I've worked within that context in all my professional life. So I'm very confident that if the need arises, I'll be able to deal with it.
Thank you very much. And now back to Claudia Beamish.
And I'd like to explore further the objectives and priorities of the new watchdog with the panelists, and if there are things that have already been highlighted by yourselves or by Jim in his the questioning from my colleague Liz, then so be it. But if you have anything to add about the objectives and priorities from your perspective, that would be very helpful. And also, very importantly, what you consider the key challenges to be, anything that hasn't been covered. So that's a sort of open question to any of you. Can I go first, please, this time to Annalisa?
Yes, thank you for that question. As I already mentioned, the main objectives of this new body are really to hold to account Scottish public authorities for compliance with environmental law. And it's a rather unique task because nobody else has been in that position of transitioning away from the system that we presently have, with the EU Commission and courts at the top of the system, if you like, into the development of a domestic system to do the same thing. And in this regard, I clearly acknowledge that we have a lot of work to do moving forward. But at the same time, I also think that this board is uniquely positioned to deliver on this demanding task. and to get down to do the job very soon, because clearly the clock is ticking on this, as so many other issues on EU exit, and we have to really, as I said, start working fast and learn by doing. And in that connection, I think as a group we are very strongly positioned to do that.
Thank you, and I'll come next to Paul, please, on the objectives and priorities, if you have anything you'd like to add on that, and also the challenges for the new body. Thank you.
Maybe just 2 points in response to that, and to add to what's already been said. For me, I think that the autonomy, impartiality and independence of this new body is absolutely essential. It's already been mentioned by Jim and other nominees to the board. I have a lot of experience in that. I understand what it means to be an evidence provider for decision makers, and to sometimes be put under a bit of pressure, and how to withstand that pressure. So for me, the independence is absolutely essential for this body. And the second comment I'd like to make is on the scope of the work, and not to interfere in a parliamentary process, but my experience of working with the environment teaches me that you can't deal with the environment just in isolation. I think the scope of the drivers and the pressures for environmental challenges are so broad. I think that the new body will need to have a rather broad remit to go into the particular sectors or issues that it needs to go into. So I think the scope of the new body should remain rather broad. So again, not to interfere in a parliamentary process, we will study the bill when it's adopted. But those would be the 2 things I would add: independence and scope.
Thank you very much. And to Marie, please.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm comfortable with the objectives that Jim's outlined. We had a brief conversation about these late last week. I guess for me, what I'm really keen to make sure is that the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, that we don't lose sight of that, because often setting up an organisation, particularly at speed, means that we're obviously moving quickly. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're improving the outcomes in terms of the environment for Scotland, and so having the right measurements for the board in terms of our ability to actually make a difference would be something I'm really keen to make sure we don't lose sight of. So as we develop the strategy, it's really important for me that we develop a set of metrics or measurements that we can see the outcomes that are not just about numbers, it's about a real change and progress in terms of the environment. And I guess for me, the biggest challenge is the fact that we're trying to set up an organisation in the middle of a pandemic. And so we're having to do things very differently. I mean, today's a good example. And how you then set up an organisation and get people working together is probably more challenging than we would normally if we were setting up an organisation in normal times.
Thank you. And Richard, please.
Thank you. So I agree with everything everyone's said. I think particularly demonstrating our independence is a really important early thing to do. One of the objectives for me, and Jim mentioned this, is making links to the stakeholders, and so I've already suggested I would hope to be a strong link with SEPA to understand its concerns and optimism about ESS and how we might work together in the future. But I would, because of where I come from, I would also hope to be a very strong link with the civil society, environment and climate change networks, British Environment Link and Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, etc. So establishing those relationships early on would be one of my objectives. I think there's an issue that is not yet decided, and it will be decided as the bill is finalised, which is what is our role in climate change. And so there are different opinions on that, and I think that's very important, is where we end up on that. Obviously, we have the role of the UK Committee on Climate Change to think about, who are advisors, but they are not, in the same sense as ESS, looking at the effectiveness of legislation and regulation, and so they are different things. So I will be very interested to see where that finally lands when this becomes an act and ESS becomes a full body. And then finally, a challenge, I think, is getting stakeholders to understand very clearly what ESS is and what it isn't. As Liz Smith said, there are lot of public expectations about ESS, but I'm not sure all of those people have actually read the bill as it is currently. And so one of our key tasks, because Environmental Standards Scotland is not necessarily obvious from the title exactly what we do, and Elisa has summarised it very nicely, but I think that's one of our challenges, is to get the media, politicians other than yourselves, and the stakeholders that we deal with to understand what it is we will do and what it is not part of our remit and we can't help you with.
Thank you, Richard. And could I come to you, Jim, to make any comments which you haven't already made in relation to and, of course, challenges? Thank you.
Yeah, I set out my priorities in my earlier answer.
Thank you.
One thing I would say to the committee is that although the bill has yet to go through stage 3, although it's yet to go through, already I've been working with people to try to put together an initial secretariat team so that if we get to the 1st of January and the body is able in an advisory fashion or a non-statutory fashion to begin its work, we will already at that stage, I hope, have key personnel in place on an interim basis to help the board to move forward. So I would anticipate this board meeting early in January to begin its work.
Thank you. And now,
thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia. Now we have specific questions directed at the chair, to Jim. One from Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks, convener. I was going to ask you about vision and priorities. I think, Jim, you've answered most of that. I had sort of two questions that have come out of your answers, though. One was about what's your vision for working with this committee or this successor committee, how you intend to, as a board, to basically inform this committee and our work programme and what we're working to. The other point was about funding. All public bodies have, challenging discussions with government often about funding and about, their needs, particularly in straitened times. So I just wonder how you might approach that. What you think might be an appropriate level of reporting or approach in terms of identifying what your funding needs are, either to this committee or to government.
I think the relationship with the committee is going to be a very important one. We will not, as a board, be directed by the committee. We are independent of you as well as we are independent of government, and I want to make that clear very, very early on. But I would hope that as part of the transparency I'm looking for, that there'll be regular reporting to the committee, and whenever the committee wants to speak to me or other board members about where we are and what we're doing, as far as we can, we will share that with the committee. So I would like an open, transparent relationship with the committee, and I'd like to meet the committee on a reasonably regular basis to make sure that the committee is aware of what we are doing, and that where necessary, if we need the committee's support in anything, that you understand where we are coming from and how we've arrived at the position we've arrived at. So I'd look for a fairly open relationship with you if that is what you or your successor committees want. As to funding, there is a financial memorandum with the bill. I haven't been involved in constructing that. I think that one of the early things the board will need to do is to work out what it is we want to do and what it will cost to do it. And I think Marie is very clearly spells out a key thing here, and it has to be based on outcomes as well as processes and procedures. So I think at a very early stage, the board in its determination of what its strategy would be, will in parallel with that, have to have a clear financial programme that we can present. Now, if I think currently the figure in the financial memorandum is £1.5 million, which I believe is based on the establishment of other bodies, we will have different responsibilities and duties within ESS that we need to fund. If I believe that 1.5 million is insufficient, or if the board believes that, then we will be making sure people understand what it is we need to do our business effectively and efficiently. I've been in the past in public bodies where budgetary discussions have become difficult. I would expect nothing else. But if we're going to create this new body and we're serious about it, we have to make sure that we're funded to carry out the task appropriately.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And now final questions from Finlay Carson. Finlay.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. We've heard a broad range of responses and the questions we've had, so I think my question's appropriate to wind up the session, and that's to ask you, Jim, what is your approach to developing the strategy and programme of work for ESS?
First thing the board will need to do is to sit down and look at the bill once it's passed. We will then need to, as a board, work out how it is that we want to deliver on the responsibilities and duties given to us. We'll need to engage with all our stakeholders, and in that I don't mean just the public bodies, us, the Nature Scotland, the local authorities, Scottish Government, but also with the sector generally, with NGOs, with other bodies who have got an interest. And we need to then, at that point, listen to what people are saying to us, decide whether or not that influences the way that we're going to go, and then present a coherent strategy, hopefully in less time than is set out in the legislation, because I think giving us a year to develop a strategy is very generous. But I think it can be done more quickly than that. It needs to be. We must not lose sight of the reason why this body is being created, and that is because when we exit from the European Union, there will be a gap, and we need to fill that gap as quickly as possible. But we need to do it in the right way, which means the strategy has to be right. And from the strategy, everything else we do follows. So I see an engagement between the board, the sector, all interested parties in helping us determine what that strategy should be.
Finlay, are you happy with that? I just wanted to, we have kind of more or less come to the end of our session, but there is a little bit of scope. If there's anything else, Jim, that you wanted to add, I think particularly I would like you to reflect on a very important body being set up, new, as you say, filling in a governance gap. How do you see, you've already mentioned making parliamentarians aware of what your remit is and getting to know parliamentarians. Wider society, though, how do you see developing your Civic Scotland's understanding about what you do?
We, very briefly, we've only had about an hour to chat to each other before this meeting. But I think one of the things that we mentioned in that hour is that we need to have a very strong engagement strategy, which is broad. We need to have a very good communication strategy as well. So in the very early stages of creating our team, our executive team, we will need to be thinking about how that team will influence and will get the message about what ESS is and, as Richard said, isn't, across to parliamentarians, to the media, to broader Civic Scotland. Now, we're setting ourselves an awful lot of things to do in a very short period of time. But if we're going to get a strategy to be a bottom-up rather than a top-down strategy, then that engagement and that communication needs to be one of the first things that we prioritise within the organisation so that we can get input from people. And what I want the board to do, although this will come as news to them because we haven't discussed it yet, I want the board to think about, what we need to do for setup, where we want to be in a year, where we want to be in 2 years, 3 years. And that once we've got these things in our head, to build an initial structure, including an engagement strategy to facilitate that. So it's something I'm thinking about at the moment and something that the board will have to tackle at a very early stage.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for making time this morning. I know it hasn't been easy to get everyone together very quickly after the nominations were announced, but I want to thank you for your flexibility this morning and for everything that you've told us. The committee will consider the evidence heard this morning later in the meeting, and I'm now going to suspend this meeting for 5 minutes to allow a change in witnesses. Thank you. Welcome back. Our third item on our agenda is to take evidence on the Invasive Non-Native Species EU Exit Scotland Amendment, Regulations 2020. I have the Minister for Rural Affairs and National Environment, Mara Goujon, and the Minister is joined by her officials, Matthew Bird, Biodiversity Team Leader, and Hazel Riley, Lawyer for the Scottish Government. Welcome to you all. Welcome, Minister. Minister, if you have anything to say ahead of our questions, I can hand over to you. Otherwise, Minister?
That would be great. Thank you. I just to give some introductory remarks.
Thank you.
Okay, well, the purpose of the draft regulations, well, for today's purposes, the 2020 regulations, is to ensure that the safeguards against invasive non-native species set out in Regulation EU 1143/2014 of the European Parliament and of the Council are maintained in Scotland when the UK leaves the European Union. The 2020 regulations achieve this by setting out the rules to prevent, minimise and mitigate the adverse impact on biodiversity of the introduction and spread of invasive non-native species in Scotland, whether intentional or unintentional. And while the EU regulations have direct effect in Scotland, certain aspects of the INNS management regime, such as enforcement and licensing measures, have already been implemented in domestic legislation through amendments to the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. Now, the regulations being considered today apply only to Scotland, and a separate UK instrument covers the remainder of the UK. The UK regulations also apply in respect of areas that the UK government considers reserved as they apply to invasive non-native species, including imports to and exports from the EU. The Scottish Government's position remains that the content of the EU regulation on invasive alien species is devolved. However, in order to ensure legal certainty for stakeholders and to have a functioning statute book at the end of the transition period, we've decided to adopt a pragmatic approach. And the draft SSI therefore contains an application provision to ensure that the legislation is as clear as possible to the reader, and in particular when the UK SI applies and when the Scottish rules do. And the Scottish Government will produce guidance for stakeholders to assist their understanding of the legislation and the application of the two codes. Now, the main effect of the 2020 regulations is to adopt the EU list of invasive species of concern as the Scottish list of species of special concern, and to enable Scottish ministers to amend that list by regulations. And the policy intention is to maintain the content of this list so that it matches as closely as possible the list of species of special concern that will apply in the rest of the UK, while also retaining the flexibility to list species of particular concern within Scotland. The regulations also provide that emergency measures can be introduced where Scottish ministers have evidence concerning the presence or imminent risk of introduction of invasive non-native species. And these emergency measures are a rapid way of introducing restrictions as a precautionary measure, while a risk assessment is undertaken to consider whether it's necessary to add a species permanently to the list of species of concern. Any emergency measures that are introduced would be time limited for a period of up to 2 years. So the effect of that would be to allow Scottish ministers to take all necessary steps to prevent invasive non-native species from being kept, bred, placed on the market, used or exchanged, permitted to reproduce, released into the environment or transported within Scotland. The regulations also further provide that Scottish ministers will be assisted on invasive non-native species by a committee and by a scientific forum. And they do that by referring to the UK Invasive Non-Native Species Amendment Regulations 2019 as amended, which will make provision for the relevant articles of the EU regulation to have effect for the UK as a whole. And that will enable Scottish ministers to appoint representatives to the new UK statutory bodies, the committee and the scientific forum, which will be created after EU exit. And the amendments made by the 2020 regulations don't amount to a change in policy from the way in which the EU regulation currently operates. They correct deficiencies that arise as a result of EU exit to ensure that the legislation continues to operate effectively. And in addition to the issues covered in this statement, the amendments include removing or replacing EU terminology, for example, replacing references to Member States and the European Commission with references to Scotland and Scottish ministers as appropriate, as well as revoking provisions with no relevance to the operation of the invasive non-native species regime in the Scottish context. So with that, both myself and my officials would be happy to take any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you, Minister. I have a question from Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks very much for that outline, Minister. Can I just ask then, in relation to Nature Scot and SEPA, will they effectively then sit on the new committee or the science forum? I'm just trying to work out where those bodies actually sit in relation to the decision-making framework around the inclusion of non-native invasive species.
No problem. I'd be happy to explain a bit about how the committee and the scientific will be formed. So just to give a bit of background to that, an invasive species programme board was established in 2005, and that was to deliver the strategic consideration of the threat of invasive species across GB, and the board includes senior representatives from England, Scotland and Wales and relevant agencies who all exercise responsibility in their own areas as representatives of wider interests. So the programme board will remain as a separate non-statutory body, and again that comprises members from Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So even though the new body, which is the committee, would be a separate body as established by the 2020 regulations, the members of that committee appointed by each of the administrations would be the same as the members of the programme board. And for the scientific forum as well, we already have similar mechanisms in place, and it would be the people that are on the boards that are in existence already that would then form the committee and the scientific forum. And I would say that we work very closely with all the relevant agencies, and Scotland would have representatives on each of these, so we wouldn't envisage that changing. So they would still have some input, and we work very closely with other nations of the UK as well on this.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mark. And now Liz Smith has a question.
Could I just ask a very brief question? I mean, this is obviously extremely technical and quite difficult. And just in terms of ensuring the sort of alignment between what's been happening in the UK and what's been happening or will be happening in Scotland, is it really a time difference that you are trying to overcome? I'm always slightly worried when there are rules for the lawyers and rules for the rest of us.
Yes, I mean, it's definitely not an easy challenge, I think, to work through some of the secondary legislation that we've had to do. But to put it in very simplistic terms, again, there was a contested area here about what was reserved and what was devolved. So we really, through this instrument, tried to make that process as straightforward as possible and make it as clear as possible as to which regulations would apply in which circumstances. And just to give you an idea, for example, if somebody was looking to import a species that was on the list of concern to Scotland, now the import and export relates to the UK instrument, so they would have to seek a permit from the Secretary of State for Scotland for that to apply. But if that person then wanted to bring that species into Scotland, if they wanted to breed, keep, or any of the other uses that are in the regulation there, they would have to apply for a permit from Scottish ministers. So I hope that explains how the two regulations would work alongside each other in practice. So I hope that answers Liz' question, but I'd be happy to give a bit more detail if that wasn't sufficient.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. That seems to have answered this question. Thank you very much. And no other members are wishing to ask any questions. So our next item today is to invite the Minister to move motion S5M 23440 that the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee recommends that the invasive non-native species EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020 be approved. Can I ask the Minister to move the motion?
Formally moved, Convener.
Thank you. If any members got any comments, this is your time to say so in the chat function. Doesn't look like anybody has any comments to make. Right. The question then is that motion S5M 23440 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. You're agreed that the motion be passed. Okay, thank you. Thank you to the Minister and for the officials for coming in front of us today. Our fifth item today is consideration of a negative instrument, the Producer Responsibility Obligations Packaging Waste Amendment, Scotland Regulations 2020. Do any members have any comments to make with regard to this? Look in the chat box. I'm not seeing anyone has anything to say. Thank you. Therefore, that concludes our meeting in public today. Our next meeting on the 15th of December, we will consider an updated work programme and arrangements for publication of our report and our inquiry into regional marine planning. Thank you all. Now, close this meeting.